Nintendo patents a dual screen gaming device. What are the 5 best games in history? And is Super Mario Bros. Wonder actually any good? It's the LP Podcast. Hello and welcome to the very first LP podcast. I am LP and I play Nintendo games and I talk a lot. Obviously, the second half of that sentence is going to ring more true than the first half over the course of the next 30 to 40 minutes. I intend to cover gaming news, my own opinions, and potentially your own questions as a result. Let's start with the first. So, Nintendo patents a dual screen gaming device that can be split in half. This is an interesting bit of news that came out this week. I don't necessarily know that this means anything. Some people are speculating that this means this is the direction that the Switch's successor is going to head in, right? Some sort of connectable screen where you can leave one in the dock, the other on top of it, pull it out, use both almost in a DS-like fashion. And let's assume for a second that this is going to be true, right? What then? What would that look like? I don't know. To be honest with you, it almost sounds like it wouldn't have the structural integrity that I would want because you look at a Switch, right? You see this, and you try and imagine two of these on top of each other. I don't know. It seems a little bit unwieldy, but perhaps that's just me. But I don't necessarily know that I would love that. Of course, Nintendo does tend to know more than I do about creating gaming consoles. They've created what, dozens? I've created none at all. So hey, track records may speak for themselves, but that is TBA. The reason I originally said, however, that I don't necessarily know that this is the direction it's going to go is based upon what was discovered in the same fashion by, homing in on patents during the upcoming months to the Switch's release. If you remember, they patented this weird, like, oval-shaped device. It was like entirely a screen. Obviously, that has nothing to do with what the Switch ended up being. So I think that this is just Nintendo having an idea in keeping it, for lack of a better word, right? They have this idea. They think maybe sometime in the future we could be using this, and they hoard it. I don't think Nintendo would be giving away secrets like this out in the open. Moving down across, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to comb through the top posts of Reddit and our Nintendo for the week, as well as the top news stories in Microsoft's Bing's search. You'll see there that the Nintendo patent is kind of top of mind for multiple different reasons. Now, if we scroll down, you might find something different. Hopefully. We'll see if there's anything actually otherwise interesting happening. IGN has an interesting article here. The headline spoke to me. 2023 marks the turning point for Nintendo as a full-blown entertainment brand. Nintendo goes to Hollywood. So, just skimming this, it looks like it's putting a lot of emphasis on the Super Mario Bros. Movie as well as Super Nintendo World's opening in Hollywood. And I would agree. Those two forays into alternate means of entertainment were not necessarily novel concepts for Nintendo. If you'd remember, they've been involved in movie production in the past, but the production of the Super Mario Bros. Movie also saw the inception of Nintendo Pictures, which is its own standalone company falling under the greater umbrella that is Nintendo. Obviously, one would have to guess or imagine that this is going to result in more Nintendo films, and I think that's significant. The Mario Brothers movie was an immense success, and for good reason. If you didn't watch it, let me tell you, it was good. I watched it a handful of times, both in theater and outside. I own a copy. And it could be due to my own Nintendo fanboyism that's skewing my opinion ever so slightly. But that aside, it was a well-made and entertaining piece of media. And as Nintendo continues to expand, obviously with the aforementioned Super Nintendo World, well, I think that 2023 absolutely will reflect back on the year as a harbinger of what was to come. Because not even singling out those two otherwise forays into alternate means, Nintendo had a great year for games. And we'll talk a little bit more about that once we get into the Super Mario Wonder segment. But when you go back to the very beginning of the year, even things like Fire Emblem Engage, and then, of course, Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, and every other single piece of media that they were putting out on the Switch itself specifically was borderline good. You know, obviously not everything can be good, and some things were more great than good. I'm looking at you, Pikmin 4. They had an excellent year, in my own opinion. And if I had to rank them, if I had to put, let's say, a top 3 out, and the year's still not even over, right? We've got things like Super Mario RPG on the horizon, which is something to be excited for. I would put Tears of the Kingdom number 1, Pikmin 4 number 2, and then we might put Super Mario Wonder number 3. We'll see. We'll see. We'll talk about that here in a second. Back to the headlines. Let's scroll back down and see what else the news world has for us Nintendo fans. Nintendo unveils the first sign for the Nintendo Museum today. Very cool, as detailed by SiliconEra.com. The sign looks like the present-day Nintendo logo with the word museum underneath. Thanks, Famitsu. Very cool. So this is supposed to open in 2024. It is in Japan. I believe it should tell us here what prefecture it's in. If not, that's fine. Yeah, I don't see it off a quick scan. But obviously, it's in Japan. It's something that is, I think, going to be seen as a bit of a mecca, if you will, for Nintendo fans. And while we were talking about Nintendo expanding into different types of markets, what with the film and the amusement park worlds, opening up a museum is probably something that I would have assumed them to have done years ago, right? And I guess that may be a little bit presumptuous for them to have done because, all things considered, they're a very old company, but their gaming side of the company is relatively young in comparison to the overall company's age itself. And I would have to imagine that the Nintendo Museum is going to focus in on the gaming side of their business, but they do have a huge amount of history outside of it. If you'd know, Nintendo started as a card company, a card game specifically, if I remember correctly. And obviously, they've maintained the gaming side of it quite well, transforming into the virtual electronic juggernaut that they are today. And I, personally, would love to travel to view the Nintendo Museum. Scrolling back down along the headlines, what do we have happening here? Let's flip back over to Reddit and see if anyone has something interesting for us. This looks like it could be something. The Super Smash Bros. Ultimate director is skeptical future titles can match its scope, which, if you haven't played Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, the game is big, okay? We're talking millions of, no, not millions of characters, but a lot of characters, all right? The roster is quite expansive, and I'd have to imagine that Masahiro Sakurai, very much aligned with what I'm thinking here, is that that's not necessarily that is scalable. During a presentation on YouTube regarding the concepts behind Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, game director Masahiro Sakurai expressed skepticism over future titles in the series being able to match the game's scope. Look at that. He said he's unsure about what comes next for the Smash series. That is interesting. It gives us a little bit of a time, a little bit of an opportunity here to theorize what could come next. To be honest with you, I thought Smash Ultimate was great. Yes, there was an enormous amount of characters, and of course, as we talked, that scope is hard to maintain, to scale. How do you build off that and do something different? And then you talk about all the different third parties that were involved as well, right? Because you had Sora in there, you had a number of different characters from third parties that you'd undoubtedly have to get into like licensure issues with in order to bring them over to the next one. So what I would expect, and I don't know if this is a hope, but what I would expect would be for them to scale it back a bit, maybe not to the terms of, Smash Bros. 64, but somewhere along Smash Bros. Melee, I felt like had a good balance in terms of the amount of characters and the diversity of them. Now, that's not to say just go back to that exact same slate of characters and call it good, but something along those lines, maybe a little larger, maybe even a little bit smaller. I think that kind of honing it in and maybe diversifying in the way of the gameplay a little bit. I know that could be sacrilege to some, right? Because Smash Brothers gameplay has, by and large, stayed relatively consistent since its inception in the 90s. Of course, you do have different techniques slowly being added, but I'm talking about a large-scale change in my conceptualized world, all right? I'm talking about the ability to customize your attacks, perhaps. The ability to take attacks from other characters, maybe even a character creation mode. Wouldn't that be interesting? Not necessarily sure Nintendo would go for that, but I think that that would have some semblance of promise in our current industry. Scrolling back down through the Reddit headlines, it looks like Nintendo updated their content guidelines for web content and social media. Well, isn't that interesting? That's something that I should be particularly well aware of, given the fact that I, make exclusively Nintendo-related crap. So, after nearly 5 years, Nintendo updated their Nintendo game content guidelines for online video and image sharing platforms. User Mazel5 went through it to provide us a little bit of an overview. It looks like it is largely due to infringing intellectual property rights, features pirated in Nintendo software. So it has to do primarily, it looks like, with obscene, graphic, or explicit content and using Nintendo IPs for that, as well as piracy in the way of emulation or showing how to emulate or pirate Nintendo IPs. Altogether, I think that's reasonable. People get on Nintendo's back oftentimes for being quote unquote unfriendly to the consumer, but I don't agree with that. To be honest with you, I think Nintendo's extraordinarily friendly to the consumer. Nintendo just has in mind who their specific consumer should be, if that makes sense, all right? They know who they want to be patronizing them, and they are catering directly to that market. And more power to them, right? It's their company. They see fit to run it how they want. It's not going to make everyone happy, but I think it's more than reasonable. Moving back into the Nintendo headlines for our Reddit, we'll scroll back up here and see what else we can find. Now, we're going to get to Super Mario Wonder, but it looks like there were some new updates over the last week to Nintendo Switch Online and Expansion Pass. Mario Party 3, the classic. I remember the last time I played Mario Party 3, I was at a McDonald's. If you grew up in the 90s, you would remember that McDonald's used to have N64 hubs inside the playrooms. Yes, children running through the ball pit, peeing in the slide, guzzling Sprite and throwing hamburgers down their gullets, also rubbing their greasy mitts all over the controllers. Truly, one of the most sanitary experiences I've ever had. But I've hardly ever been sick, and maybe that is where I developed my amazing immune system. Either that or genetics, who's to say? But point is, Mario Party 3 returns to the playable screen, or for the first time rather, Nintendo Switch Online, and that is a big news. Speaking of Nintendo Switch Online and additions there, where's Golden Sun? Golden Sun was teased at the very first unveiling of the Game Boy Advance addition to Nintendo Switch Online. Still not here. Still not here, nearly a year later. So that's very curious to me, but it's on its way. Allegedly. They wouldn't have shown it if it wasn't. Right? Who's to say? Thankfully, I have a copy of Golden Sun and have since been able to play it, but I very much want everyone to have that opportunity because it is a fantastic game. That being said, it is actually not on my top 5 game list. And I think we should cover that now. Top 5 games of all time. This might throw some of you for a loop. In no particular order, mind you. These are just a grouping of the top 5. I'm going to throw a wild one out first. Super Mario Sunshine. Yes, the often lambasted, sometimes forgotten 3D platforming adventure for the Nintendo GameCube. I was, a preteen, 11, 12 years old, I believe, when I got this game, and it immediately struck me. You see, my first Nintendo console was the N64, and obviously I had Mario 64 on it. Fell in love. Absolutely adored it. So naturally, one would expect the next sequel to be just as good. And I thought so. Turns out that that's a relatively unique opinion. There are a non-zero amount of people who have no shortage of disdain for the GameCube game itself. That being said, I love it. I love the colors. I love the soundtrack. I love the FLUDD. I mean, anytime you can strap a talking backpack to your shoulders and spray your enemies down like some sort of demented super soaker, how's that not going to be a great time? I mean, seriously, it's amazing. And frankly, people talking about how they want Mario Galaxy 3, Mario Odyssey 2. Where is Super Mario Sunshine 2? The world needs more FLUDD, all right? More now than never. Number 2 on the list, Pikmin. Keeping in line with the GameCube, obviously, it was a very pivotal time for Nintendo itself. GameCube kind of sold unwell, we'll say, at least in comparison to its competitors at the time. But I, nonetheless, adored it, as well as many games on it. And that obviously is exemplified here by my listing of 2 straight GameCube games. Pikmin was a huge, huge change for myself personally. And what I remember most, a huge change for my family. You see, growing up, I was the video game player. Naturally, of course, I was the child. Yes, I had a younger brother, but I was a child in this family. My parents didn't play video games. Not a novel concept. That being said, Pikmin changed that. For whatever reason. Who's to say? Maybe it's the fact that you could enslave these little tiny beings, have them do your bidding. Maybe it's the space travel. But for whatever reason, my dad took to it. And he loved it. He loved it so much that my mother and I, were not allowed to play it when he was not there. He got that jealous over our own experiences that we had to collectively enjoy it as a family. And I have very fond memories of it. So it's not for that reason alone, though, that it's making its way into my top 5 here. Really, it was a far cry for me and a very influential game in my own growth as a gamer. Because at that point, I was primarily just focused with the Marios, Zeldas, and Pokemons of the world. Those were my games. I mean, I knew I loved Nintendo as a company, even at that age, but I didn't understand this real-time strategy sort of aspect of Pikmin, the resource management, the force management that you had to undertake in order to overcome various obstacles, whether they required the electric resistance of the yellows or the water-type gill-breathing blues. It was excellent and really opened my eyes to a number of different possibilities of what an enjoyable game could be. Third on the list, again, in no particular order, we're going slightly older. Banjo-Tooie. Now, obviously, I grew up on the N64. Banjo-Tooie is the sequel to Banjo-Kazooie, if you're unfamiliar. And a lot of people really enjoyed Kazooie, but a lot of people still yet didn't attempt to play Tooie. Now, of course, this is anecdotal evidence, and I don't have stats to back that up, but from the individuals I've spoken with, my wife being one of them, she grew up with Banjo-Kazooie, never even had an opportunity to play Banjo-Tooie, so it's as a result of this, in my opinion, that Tooie has gone relatively underrated. I think what Tooie did was took everything that was good about Kazooie and made it better. All right, yes, you do have a different sort of hub world, and some people didn't like that. Other people do enjoy the overall expansive feel of Tooie, and I'm in that second camp. I really did enjoy it. What's more, I enjoyed the particular effects that you could gain. It differed from stage to stage to stage, and yes, you did have mumbo transformations and the like in Banjo-Kazooie, but it just felt like a step up to me, like a very natural progression, and it's really sad to me that it stopped there. You know, Microsoft's acquisition of Rare in the early 2000s really derailed what I thought could have been another promising Nintendo IP along the likes of Mario and Zelda. What could have been? You know, if I could ask for one thing, it's for one wealthy benefactor to win the lottery or something and take those winnings, buy Rare, and give it back to Nintendo. Or at the very least, buy Rare and rip it out of Microsoft so they can actually do something with it, all right? The rights to Banjo-Kazooie cannot suffer any longer. Or maybe they can. I don't know. I hope not. Anyways, number 4, Mother 3. Taking a quick detour from the world of the 3D to the Game Boy Advance and a detour from the localized North American games, Mother 3 was a Japan exclusive. Threw a little flair there, Japan. It was never actually translated or released in the Western world, which is too bad because it's a fan-friggin-tastic game, all right? The list of games that have made me cry is about this long. And Mother 3 is in size 12 font, all right? It's taken up almost that whole space. Mother 3 is an excellent game. The sequel to Earthbound and Earthbound Beginnings, otherwise known as Mother, was fantastic. It was a little bit of a departure from the relatively open feel of Earthbound and evolved into a much more linear story, in my opinion. But the story was excellent, all right? And I'm not going to spoil anything for you in case you haven't played it, but I'll just say this. You need to, okay? It's a great game. If you like RPGs, okay, if you're a big fan of great writing, if you get involved in the characters that you're playing with or as or around inside of the game world, I think Mother 3 is a great time for you. And it can be enjoyed as a standalone adventure. I know I mentioned it as a third in a series of 3, but each one of those 3 Mother games, by and large, are their own stories. There are certain references to each for that and the other, but it doesn't change the overall experience, in my opinion. Moving on, 5th and final in the top 5. You'll notice there, none of those games were created any earlier than 2006. But this one was Tears of the Kingdom. That's right. 2023's mega hit open world Zelda instant classic, Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, instantly made my top 5 the minute I started playing it. A little bit of hyperbole there, maybe like 25, 30 minutes after I started playing it. It's so good. All right, you talk about Banjo-Tooie taking what Kazooie did and expanding on it, making it better. Tears of the Kingdom did that for Breath of the Wild in spades. All right, you look back at Breath of the Wild, everything that made Breath of the Wild a unique, novel experience, the open world nature, the abilities with the Sheikah Slate, things like Magnesis specifically. Tears of the Kingdom took that and made them better. You want Magnesis? Have Magnesis on everything. All right, you can grab whatever you want with your gosh darn Ultra Hand. You can fuse it. You want to put a fish on your forehead? You can do it. This is Hyrule, baby. There are no rules, except for what you make of them. And I thought that's great. All right, there are a few qualms. It's not a perfect game by any means, okay? And I still did want more in the way of dungeons. I know that many people are in that camp. In fact, some people are so hard in that camp that they downright go to say that these games are bad. Part of me feels like they're just haters, but everyone's entitled to an opinion, and that's absolutely fine. That being said, what I think Tears of the Kingdom did that sets it apart so much more so from Breath of the Wild was the size. And I didn't think it could get any bigger. All right, I remember the first time stepping off the Great Plateau like I'm in the friggin' Republic of Texas. There's so much land and so little time. Fast forward to Tears of the Kingdom, and it's that, but like times 2.5. All right, you have the depths, spoiler alert, in case you haven't played it, which are essentially the same size as Hyrule, and then the Sky Islands, which are but a fraction of the size, but still explorable land all the same. So I'm particularly excited about what this means for the Zelda franchise going forward. There's no telling what direction they'll take. I know some people have opined that they should perhaps return to their roots in a way, to the dungeon crawler action adventure tones of the predecessors, and I think that'd be fine. You know, I grew up a Zelda fan. I've played and beaten pretty much every single game, well, almost, and I love them all. It's my favorite franchise by far. By a decent margin, we'll say. Far is a little bit embellishment. But that being said, I'm a huge fan of that, and if the company decided to return to those roots, you'd have no argument here. That being said, I don't think they will. I really don't. I think that they'll just take what Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom did and expand on it. Now, that may not mean that it's in the same world, the same specific Hyrule, right? I don't necessarily know that it'll be a direct sequel the way that Majora's Mask was to Ocarina of Time or the way that Tears of the Kingdom was to Breath of the Wild. But I do think that the relatively large-scale open world adventure is going to continue. And I'm excited for it. And speaking of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, you'll notice that they were omitted from my top 5. If you're a hardcore Zelda purist, don't worry. They're both my honorable mention. My honorable mentions, just N64 Zelda in general. All right, I've mentioned it a couple of times today already. N64 was the console that I grew up with. It was my first Nintendo console. As such, well, you'd have to imagine that Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask were very, very influential in my budding video game brain. Ocarina of Time was my first Zelda game, and it was a Zelda game that I didn't even want. But I loved it all the same. You see, when I was 7, 8 years old, Majora's Mask came out, and I saw it in Nintendo Power. I was like, hot dog? That looks sweet. Mother, please procure this game for me. She's like, all right, we can get this. She brings home Ocarina of Time. So that's not it. I was pissed. I was very upset. But after a small amount of time, I fell in love with it. And in fact, I'd probably rank Ocarina of Time over Majora's Mask, though they are just so interchangeably amazing, great games. In fact, if I hadn't played both of them so many times, they'd probably still be in my top 5. And really, they honestly are in my top 5 in spirit. How can you rate such a huge selection of great games that Nintendo has and pick 5 of them? I don't know. Because you have things like the Paper Mario series as well. Paper Mario 64 and Thousand Year Door probably vying for a slot in there as well. So who's to say? Ultimately, there's a lot of great Nintendo games, and we are lucky to be experiencing them. Speaking of great Nintendo games, is Super Mario Bros. Wonder one of them? Now, no spoilers for those of you who have yet to play it. I've yet to play a whole lot of it yet, but I have played roughly 5 to 6 hours of it. So I have at least a little bit of an opinion to formulate it. And what's more, we have sales data to get some numbers here. So it looks like Super Mario Bros. Wonder has achieved impressive sales figures since its release, becoming the fastest selling Mario game in Europe in 3 days. Granted, that's about one part of the world, but I do think that speaks to the impact it's having. People who grew up with early 2D platformer Mario games are already ravishing this game with praise, and rightfully so. For that style of game, it is excellent. It is great. It is phenomenal. It has all the best parts of the 2D Mario adventure, and even takes away, in my opinion, some of the worst parts, like the timer. I know that's probably a hot take because some people absolutely miss the timer and feel like the removal of it makes the game quote-unquote too easy, but you're entitled to speed through the gosh darn level like a cracked out squirrel as often as you want. For people like me who are not great at 2D platformers, removal of a timer is almost a necessity. Oh, that being said, I enjoy the game. At this point, with only 6 hours-ish into it, I'd give it a solid, 7.5 out of 10. Of course, subject to change as I play more of it, but the only big qualm I have is not a fair one. I'll be the first to admit. My only qualm with it is that it's not a 3D Mario, which is dumb, right? That's not a great critique. I should be critiquing the game for what it is, and for what it is, as I mentioned, it is great. I enjoy it. It's in my Switch right now. I'm going to play more of it after I finish this podcast. That being said, I grew up with the N64. How many times can I say that in one episode? At least one more time. I grew up with the N64. Anyways, that being said, the 2D Mario adventure just doesn't have the same story components of the 3D to me. And I think that is exemplified in Super Mario Bros. Wonder. The game starts very quickly and almost instantly. Hey, go do a platformer. But why? We have this Caterpie prince and he wants us to do a thing and we're plugging things into his head and he's doing other things and that's great and all, but what's happening? Bowser's a castle? Okay. But don't listen to me. Take it on your own whim. Play the game. Experience it. I encourage you to because it is a good game. And obviously, it's selling quite well. So who's really to say what the truth of the matter is? Probably not me. One final scroll through the headlines will notice that more games are showing up on Nintendo Switch Online, which is to be exciting. Still looking out for Golden Sun. More harkens back to the Nintendo patents for the 2-screen look, which I don't believe is going to be much of anything. And then we have mentions of Super Mario RPG, which comes in less than a month. In fact, at the time of this recording, we've got but 18 days until that happens. By the time of the next podcast, we'll be talking even more about that. So those are your Nintendo news and opinions for LP. This has been the LP Podcast. I sincerely thank you for listening, for watching, what have you. Let me know what your top 5 Nintendo games are and what your thoughts are on Super Mario Bros. Wonder. I greatly encourage it, and I greatly thank you for watching. So thanks again, and I'll see you next week.